Hello and welcome to Forum at 360. I'm Matt Miller. As many as 159 canneries at one time in Alaska generated as much as 80% of the territorial revenue. And that is the subject of today's program, Alaska's Historic Canneries and the people who work there. And we have three panelists with us today to talk about Alaska's canneries. The first one, to my immediate right, is Anjuli Grantham. She's a former teacher and former curator at the Baranof Museum. She is also a historian and writer, and she currently directs the Alaska Historic Canneries Initiative. And then to her right, Bob King, former radio reporter in Dillingham, and also former gubernatorial and congressional aide, and he now researches Alaska fishing history for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. And then to his right, Katie Ringsmuth. She teaches Alaska, U.S. and world history at University of Alaska Anchorage. She's also a private history consultant, and she has authored 6 books on Alaska coastal history. Thank you both for coming in. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we get started with the discussion, we have presentations that you folks have prepared that kind of give us a little bit of an overview. So Anjuli, why don't you start with yours, please?
Yeah, I'm happy to. The Alaska Historical Society is sponsoring the Alaska Historic Canneries Initiative. The Alaska Historical Society is a statewide historical society, and we promote projects around the state regarding Alaska history. Several years ago, we all got together, a bunch of fisheries historians, people that worked in canneries, biologists, fishermen, and others, to lament the state of the preservation of canneries in Alaska. So we got ourselves together, we got the resources that we needed, and we launched the Alaska Historic Canneries Initiative last year. I want to thank our sponsors, the Alaska Historical Society, ASME, and Alaska Sea Grant. And really, the Alaska Historic Canneries Initiative is a statewide grassroots movement dedicated to raising the recognition and appreciation of the history of the seafood industry in Alaska. I think everyone recognizes the fact that the seafood industry is critical to the economy of the state. However, its role in the history and the culture and the very identity of Alaska is not quite as recognized. And so that's the point of the initiative, is to raise that recognition. There's a tendency in Alaska and also within the agencies that manage fisheries to only think about the seafood industry in biological and economic terms. And so we're really trying to focus on the cultural components of the industry and the historic places that have housed the fishing industry, like canneries. As Matt mentioned, over the course of the years, there's been hundreds of processing plants all around coastal Alaska, as many as 150 in one season. That doesn't include those that were not in operation that season, so many hundreds of sites around Alaska. However, now many of them are just archaeological sites or little nubby pilings on the beach. Although these are some of the most common property types in Alaska, if you're thinking of coastal communities, only 2 are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. 2, can you imagine? Just 2. And so we're hoping to do this project, raise recognition, and hopefully boost the number of canneries that are listed on the National Register. So canneries are historic places, and at these places, we can talk about social history, the history of science, the history of technology, cultural, environmental, and political history. I'm just going to briefly touch upon some of the reasons why canneries matter to the state of Alaska and our history. Really, it's canneries that help to create the geography of coastal Alaska as we know it today. Many towns exist only because a cannery was established there a century ago. As you all know, canneries are really seasonal places. Springtime, the work ramps up, it goes through the summer, and then it closes down in the fall. However, these hubs of activity attracted residents from nearby communities, and seasonal places became year-round places. Some examples of communities that exist and were founded as cannery sites include Petersburg and Craig in southeast Alaska, Chignik, Larsen Bay, and King Cove in southwest Alaska, and those other communities as well. And so the way that we consider coastal Alaska communities today and that geography is a result of canneries. Also, it's because of the international reaches of the seafood industry that Alaska is the diverse place that it is today. Many families exist in Alaska merely because a Filipino great-grandfather met a Tlingit great-grandmother in the can shop. It's these international reaches that have brought people from all over the world to fish and to process fish and to market those fish. And this continues today. You know, from Scandinavian and Italian fishermen to Chinese and Filipino and Latino processing workers, and now East Africans are a big portion of the cannery labor. And so really we can attribute the diversity of Alaska in many ways to the history of the seafood industry. And as much as this is a local industry, it's a global industry. With our seafood resources, we are feeding the world. And at this point, the economic importance of the state, of the canneries is very important. It impacted the development of the politics in Alaska very much. For years, as you mentioned, Matt, Territorial Alaska was funded primarily from taxes on canned salmon. It was up to 80% of the funding of the Territory of Alaska came from taxes on canned salmon. The industry was also very politically contentious. I mean, you can still say it is today, let's be honest. But before statehood, it was federal agencies who were completely responsible for the management of all Alaska fisheries, including salmon. And most Alaskans believed that this was done very poorly. Also, corporations such as the Alaska Packers Association and other large canneries owned fish traps around the state. A large portion of Alaska salmon came from these fish traps. The thing about fish traps is that you don't need fishermen. So there was an elimination of local labor there. Alaskans, almost across the board, hated fish traps, even if they were in the interior. It didn't matter where you lived. If you were an Alaskan, you likely were against fish traps. And so Alaskan politicians were able to kind of galvanize people around the idea of statehood using this cry against fish traps and also mismanagement of Alaska's fisheries by outsiders or federal agencies. And due to this emotional cry, we became a state. So in many ways, we are a state because of the seafood industry. So those are just some of the reasons why this history matters, even if you don't live in a coastal community. Briefly, I'm going to talk to you a bit about the initiative and what we've been up to. It really takes the efforts of many to preserve this history, considering it is statewide. One of the projects that we've done is with the Alaska Historical Society is we funded 7 grants to communities and individuals around Alaska, providing seed money for them to do preservation, documentation, and education projects. We provided funding in Southeast Alaska, in Kodiak, and in Bristol Bay, including to a project that Bob here and Katie are working on at the Diamond End Cannery in South Naknek, which you'll hear more about. One thing to think about, how can you all help in the audience and those that are watching on TV? Consider your own history. Many of us don't think of the things that we've experienced as being historic, but think of the photos that you have. If you were a fisherman, if you worked at a cannery, your personal archive could be important to history. If you are working for a cannery and you are a steward of a historic resource, which these are these canneries, consider ways that you can enhance the stewardship and to be a good caretaker of these old places. If you're a member of a trade association, a fishing trade association, what are you doing with those old archives? So these are things to ask yourself. These are the documents, these are the buildings, these are the artifacts that help to tell the story of the seafood industry. Moreover, everyone needs to respect historic and archaeological sites. The reason that many of these sites are now in ruins is because they've been looted over the years. And so although some people believe that they're saving places by going in and taking things from them, what's actually happening is you're removing important pieces of history. We're not able to tell the story or preserve the story completely when these sites have been looted. So really respect and stay away from these historic sites if you can. I encourage everyone to become a member of the Alaska Historical Society. That is the sponsor of this whole initiative, and with your support, we'll be able to do more to document and preserve this history. And you can find some really good resources at the website, alaskahistoricalsociety.org. We have a blog there if you want to contribute blog content. We're always looking for people to write. There's an annotated bibliography, which is very nerdy, but an exceptional resource that Bob here put together, outlining so many books and articles that talk about fisheries history in Alaska. This is a useful resource for biologists, for anthropologists, and just for anyone that wants to find out about the cannery down the street. So I recommend looking over there. So yeah.
Okay, Anjuli, thank you. Bob?
It's the work we were able to do thanks to the Alaska Historic Canneries Initiative of Katie and I out to the South Naknek Cannery. We spent a week out there, being able to look into every cubby hole and the like. Katie's going to talk a little bit more about that, but let me tell you about some of the other canneries that are around the state, because there are so many. Like I said, the peak number of canneries was in 1929, when there were 159 canneries. And that didn't include, that was just salmon. It didn't include the herring processing plants, the cold storages for halibut. It really reached across the state, and it was probably more than 200. That also didn't include the many canneries that either went belly up or caught fire and burned down and the like. There are really hundreds. The map behind us shows many of the historic canneries and the like, many of which are gone today. But let me focus on just a few. The ones of all the canneries in Alaska's history that are over 100 years old and still operating, still processing fish. The first one, it's one people should know. This was actually built by the Icy Strait Packing Company in 1899. It later was bought off by Pacific American Fisheries, turned into Petersburg Fisheries in the 60s, and now is owned by Icicle Seafoods and still operating. The Igigik Packing Company built a cannery in Bristol Bay in 1899. It was also part of the Alaska Packers Association, which shut down in the early 1980s. But it's still running. Many different owners have taken it up over the years, and interestingly enough, Icicle Seafoods is now operating it. They have for the last 10 years. In Dillingham, where I worked for many years, the first cannery was built there in 1901 by the Alaska Portland Packers Association. It burned down in 1910, was rebuilt for the following season. Later, it was bought up by Pacific American Fisheries and now operated by Peter Pan Seafoods. Of all these historic canneries that have been operating for over 100 years, it may be the oldest facility that's actually still canning fish. Just down the river from Dillingham at Ecock is a cannery built in 1903 by the North Alaska Salmon Company. It was later bought off by Libby McNeil and Libby. Later Ward's Cove Fisheries, doing business as Columbia Wards. It's now in private hands. It especially caters a lot of the set netters in the area. It's still a very viable plant for them, and they still process and they're still processing fish. Across Bristol Bay, and there's so many of these canneries, is Peterson Point. This cannery was built in 1907 by the Bristol Bay Packing Company. It burned down in 1936 and was rebuilt the next year. And actually, the reason you see two cannery buildings that are far apart is because they were afraid that if one burned down, the other one might be saved. But it's still in operation today. It's still an important cannery. It's actually so big it's used as a landmark on maps. But it's now still operated by North Pacific Seafoods. Here in town, the Excursion Inlet Cannery, or nearby, built in 1908 by the Astoria Puget Sound Company. It's now owned by Ocean Beauty. It's obviously gone under major renovations and the like over the years. I mean, I just hope I'm in that great shape when I turn 108. In Kodiak, Anjuli was showing a picture earlier of this cannery in her neighborhood. The Larsen Bay Cannery was built in 1911. The predecessor started in Karluk, nearby, but it moved to Larsen Bay because Karluk didn't have a good harbor. Larsen Bay offered one, so but it's been operating ever since. King Cove, she mentioned the canneries, the communities that grow up around. This is a picture of the King Cove Cannery when it was built in 1911 by Pacific American Fisheries again. It's now run by Peter Pan. It looks pretty remote, but a community has grown all around it, and it was a prime location for salmon and also crab. Across the way is Port Moller, built by PAF in 1912 and still in operation by Peter Pan Seafoods. In Naknek, the Red Salmon Cannery was built 100 years ago in 1916. And it had, if fire is a good reason to modernize canneries, provides the opportunity to modernize canneries and rebuild them. Red Salmon had the good fortune of burning down twice in its history, first in 1929 and then in 1973, and it's still in operation today. It's a much more modern facilities, although you can see on the waterfront there's still some of the original buildings. Those are probably the net lofts and the like, but it's still in operation by North Pacific Fisheries. Of course, fire always hasn't been good for canneries. This is the Warren Cannery, built by the Alaska Portland Packers Association in 1919. It was named, by the way, after Frank M. Warren, the man who patented the retort, the pressure cookers that made the canned salmon industry possible, who did quite well, actually, with his retort and the like, that he was able to take a vacation with his wife, took a cruise line to Europe, and unfortunately booked a return trip on the Titanic. His wife survived. Unfortunately, Frank didn't. This cannery was operated until the 1950s. Through the 1950s, it was still used as a boat storage and the like when it caught fire and destroyed in 2001. There's some of the risks. I mean, these old wooden structures, massive timbers and the like. A cigarette gets thrown in the wrong direction, and it can cause destruction like this. Other canneries just fade away. This is a cannery on the Kvichak River, the Diamond X Cannery, built in 1900. It closed in 1941 because of the start of World War II, and it never reopened after the war. I took this picture back in 1994. You can see that that's all that was left standing of this building. It hadn't burned, but it had fallen apart by wind and the like, and a lot of people salvaged a lot of the timbers from around it. And I'm sure this standing section is no longer standing today. One other picture of a local cannery that I found. This is the San Juan Packing Company in Taku Harbor, just down from Juneau. It was built in 1901. I had the good fortune of just being able to get down there a couple of years ago, and if you get there today, all you see are the pilings and a couple of buildings which are probably old bunkhouses. But Anjuli said that all that remains of many of these canneries are just timbers, old pilings that are sitting in the mud. It's for these reasons, seeing all these great facilities that have operated so long have been so important to Alaska history, Alaska's economy, and providing employment and jobs. It's why the Historic Canneries Initiative wants to work and document this. I know they can't all be preserved and saved, but be able to document the record, the story, and the people who live there. And I think Katie will talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, before you mentioned the cigarette, I was going to ask a flippant question about whether or not somebody had left the retorts going and walked away from it. Katie?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And in many ways, I'm not particularly just working on this as a professional historian. It's a very personal story for me. My father was the superintendent for the NN Cannery. He came up in 1964 to Kodiak to get a job right out of high school to work in a cannery. Unfortunately, came up in April, and the earthquake had kind of ruined, took the cannery away. So he ended up going out to Bristol Bay, where he eventually got a job in Egiak and in other places, and he ended up at the South Naknek Cannery, where he worked his way up from storekeeper to bookkeeper to assistant superintendent, and then he was the longest running superintendent, and he witnessed the transition from APA to ConAgra and then eventually to Trident Seafoods. And when he retired in the mid-1990s, he really represented the last of the APA superintendent generation.
So again, this is my home as much as it is all of our history. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the cultural history of the canneries, which I think is one of the real reasons that's driving my interest in this project. And it's one of the most significant aspects of the canned salmon industry, and why it's imperative that we preserve our canneries. These industrial sites tell a story. They brought together a mix of people: Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos, Croatians, Italians, Scandinavians, as well as Yunnan, Supiaq, Dena'ina, Inupiaq, Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian. People from around the world all encountered each other in these canneries. It's where they exchanged ideas, worldviews, even DNA. The human stories contained within these historic canneries continue to resonate today. I've heard contemporary views on immigration, and some of those views echo the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which prohibited all Chinese immigrants from entering the country. Responding to the new laws, fish packing corporations like the Alaska Packers began to experiment with new technology. The so-called iron chink was invented to replace the dwindling human workers from which the machine was unapologetically named. But for many of these Asian cannery workers, they gave their lives to Bristol Bay, and they deserve to be remembered. The information contained in our historic canneries can help to explain how Alaska natives dealt with the transition to capitalism, how the Filipino crews endured cannery life in charismatic ways, how women workers learned how to create community by generating shared experiences. Contrary to the belief that early cannery life was always gloomy and inhospitable, aspects of cannery culture depict a multi-ethnic, multi-generational community that played card games, made music, and took comfort in the bonds of friendship. As one cannery worker described it, we were intimate strangers. Still, cannery life isn't fun and games for everyone. Fish companies altered native social organizations drastically, and commercial exploitation of the salmon undermined traditional economic systems. Cannery workers stayed and married into native communities. Most significantly, canneries brought diseases that drastically disrupted indigenous populations. In the wake of the Spanish flu pandemic that hit Alaska in 1918 and continued through 1919, a devastating population change occurred, and by 1920 had tipped the scale heavily in favor of Euro-Americans. In the past, many cannery workers were discriminated against and in some cases oppressed by the industry. But the stories still swirling like ghosts in the fish house, the mess hall, the bunkhouses, the net loft. These stories remind us that these cannery people were very resilient. Cannery workers adapted to their situations. Cannery life had meaning to the people who labored at these sites, and that makes this history worth remembering. Rusted corrugated tin, broken boardwalks, the skeletal remains of bunkhouses are the enduring reminders that the past gives voice to these people. Even today, most cannery workers remain practically invisible to the historical record and are gone, many of them, and can no longer speak for themselves. Few accounts of cannery workers do exist. They're there if you look for them. But most laborers had no time to write their story. They didn't keep journals, few wrote letters. Even company records used position titles rather than personal names to identify the workers. Slimer, Patcher. And those that did attempt to leave some trace of their experience did so by carving their names and the years they worked. Any place where they could to leave their story behind. So these industrial landscapes, the buildings, the boardwalks, the machines themselves inform us about the past. They help share those stories of the people that were there. And this historic information helps historians connect the cannery experience to national events, patterns, and trends. So the National Historic Preservation Act says that the spirit and direction of the nation are founded upon and reflected in its historical heritage. Underscoring the spirit of this law was an old cannery worker who told me once that until the last chunk of cannery machinery sinks into the earth, it still means something to someone. Indeed, many of the historic canneries that still exist maintain integrity of location, association, and feeling and are significant in historic sites, and as we've mentioned, only 2 are listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And when we heard that Trident Seafoods had decided to mothball the old APA NN cannery, we felt, as historians, an urgency to act. First of all, this old cannery, the Arctic, is an old cannery. The Arctic Packing Company originally built South Naknek facility on the Naknek River in 1890 as a saltery. 2 years later, the San Francisco-based Alaska Packers Association absorbed the saltery and transformed the facility into a cannery in 1895. APA assigned the cannery the initials NN, possibly for Naknek, hence APA's Diamond Canneries. APA operated, save a few years during World War II, for over a century. So this is one of Alaska's longest running canneries. APA employed mostly immigrants from Europe to catch salmon in the double enders, men from fishing nations like Norway, Sweden, Finland, Italy, Croatia, Greece. There were Germans, Danes, even Russians. Some came as far away as Australia. To process the fish in these early days, the NN Cannery also contracted the China crew, and when laws excluded Chinese from entering the nation, Japanese, Filipino crews filled the slime lines. Women and Alaska Natives also served as cannery workers at South Naknek, and many of the Alaska Natives at the NN plant were hired from the village of New Sevenoski, located approximately 5 miles upriver from the cannery. New Sevenoski was established in 1912 after the eruption of Nova Rupta, which destroyed the old Sevenoski village located on Lake Naknek. This event connects the cannery's history to the region's even deeper cultural story. Besides work, the influenza pandemic also ties the NN Cannery to the Sevenoski residents, for many were treated at the local hospital. The event killed more Alaska Natives per capita than any place on the planet save Samoa, and marks a demographic shift throughout Alaska. The pandemic also highlights an unlikely hero who assisted the dying Alaska Natives: the doctors, the nurses, and the cannery personnel from the NN Cannery. Many of the cannery structures and machines are representative of this global cultural story, and even the oldest of these cultural properties still maintain architectural integrity. In 1892, APA dissolved, and the agricultural conglomerate ConAgra bought them out. 5 years later, Trident Seafoods merged with ConAgra, and in 1995, Trident brought out ConAgra's Alaska Holdings, took over sole operation of the South Naknek Cannery. Today, the facility is used for storage and is slated to be mothballed. Its future is uncertain. First and foremost, our NN Cannery History Project aims to document this cannery's history. Its history reflects a broad range of historic contexts: corporate, technological, economic, environmental, and of course, cultural. Thus, our primary goal as historians is to document the industrial and the cultural landscape and to preserve its multidimensional and multi-storied past. This can be achieved through the use of architectural descriptions, mapping, photography, historic archaeology, archival and corporate records, oral testimony, museum history, exhibitions that will lead to historic preservation, education, interpretation, and potentially economic development. Collectively, listing in the National Register and other ancillary history projects will provide meaning as to the cannery's historical significance and will ensure that these stories of the cannery workers are not lost, even if the buildings fade away.
Thank you. And now, Bob, you also did additional research on some of the people that work for some of these companies, is that right?
Right, the fishermen themselves. I was lucky enough to go down to Bellingham last year and went to the Center for Pacific Northwest Studies at Western Washington University. And I was actually looking for something else. But I found a bunch of boxes that were the cannery records, the fishermen's records for the Alaska Packers Association. There are these 4x6 cards that were printed and handwritten in every year. They kept records of the individuals who fished. There are a few of them have pictures. Where they came from, their catches, where they worked, what ships they sailed on. And they really paint a vivid picture of who these individuals were and the work they did back during the sailboat years, because we are talking about the sailboat years. Before powerboats were allowed into Bristol Bay, they fished from 30-foot sailboats without any the modern conveniences like motors and hydraulics, the power winches, the rollers that facilitate fishing today. A lot of them were from Italy, and there are other people from the Mediterranean, as Katie was mentioning, from Greece, from Croatia, and the like. All are fishing nations and the like, and they came over to America for jobs that were offered here. There are also a lot of Norwegians and other Europeans, and I love the picture of that guy. They record their status of filing for immigration status, filing for citizenship in the United States. They tell a lot about these individuals, and there are others, as Katie mentioned, from Sweden, from Finland, Germany, Danes, Russians, and I found one card that was from a guy from Australia. The cards list where they worked, the canneries that they worked at. The initials there, the NN, is the cannery Katie was just talking about. The M was just down the Naknek River. They list the ships they sailed on, the Great Star Fleet, the giant barks that the Alaska Packers Association brought their crews up to Bristol Bay. And then they make all kinds of marginal notes, like one year he got swamped, another year he lost his partner, what happened? I don't know what failed to join means. I think it's probably a union thing. But they listed, these other marginal notes included who the troublemakers were at the canneries. I saw one guy who was blacklisted. They also listed injuries and illness, and also deaths. We all know fishing is a dangerous business, and it was even more so back in the days of sailboats. And there are several fatalities, people who died on the fishing grounds and the like. But most interestingly, to me at least, it contained individual catch data for those guys. You know, a lot of these old-time fishermen are described as iron men in wooden boats. It honors their service as in the years before iron vessels and steel vessels, and they did everything by hand without any help from motors and hydraulics. But you look at these catches, and something really stood out for me. Now these catches, the general average you see listed is the average for every cannery. The total number of fish caught has to do with how many fish that boat, that fisherman caught. And these are in numbers of fish. This is before they weighed fish, but these are in numbers of fish. But to convert it to poundage, and most people think in pounds today, all you have to do is multiply the first number by 6. 10,000 fish was, the average weight of the fish was 6 pounds, so 10,000 fish is 60,000 pounds. 20,000 is 120,000, and you can see some with catches of over 30,000 fish. That's 180,000 pounds. And these are big numbers, even compared to averages today. And remember, these guys are fishing from boats. They're pulling their nets by hand out of the water, and after they get their catch in, they have to pitch that fish up to the tally scale one at a time with a device called a pew. These guys were really strong. When the wind went slack in the days in sail, they had to row their boats too. So they got a complete workout, and they were fishing pretty much 24/7 in the early years. Out of all these guys, and there were hundreds, maybe thousands of these cards. I didn't have a chance to look at them all, but one guy stood out from among them all. A guy named Gennaro Camporiale. He was an Italian immigrant, lived in San Francisco, lived half a mile from Fisherman's Wharf. He fished in Igigik from 1914 to 1938. And his records, when you add them up, it shows he caught over 500,000 fish, 3 million pounds over his career that he picked and delivered just with the strength of his arms. And when I looked at his, if you go down to 1918, 1 year he caught 40,000 fish. That's a catch of 240,000 pounds. 4 years later, he topped that. He caught 45,000. It's 270,000 pounds in a single year. He and all these guys, I think, the message that I took home from this was that they deserve the reputation of being known as the Iron Men of Bristol Bay. And there are also Alaska natives and local residents who participated in the fishery. Many don't show up on these cards, but I did see a card for this guy. He was my friend Johnny Nicholson. He was born in Clark's Point in the Nushagak near Dillingham back in 1907. He fished for 64 seasons, many of those in the sailboat years. In fact, he didn't really care for sailboats. He thought he was a better seaman in a sailboat. He's gone now, but he and the other native fishermen, who also fished, also deserve the reputation of being known as Iron Men. And many of them, in fact, are remembered. If you go to the graveyards of Bristol Bay, the sailboat fishermen are remembered with a depiction of a sailboat, the classic double ender with its spritsail. It's hard to miss. But it honors the individuals who fished during the sailboat years and honors them as the Iron Men of Bristol Bay.
Well, thank you. And Anjuli, I wonder if you can tell me a little bit more about how the initiative got started, what prompted its generation?
Well, really, over the years, we've just become dismayed to watch all of these canneries slip into the sea before their stories were recorded. In Alaska, a lot of historic preservation work happens because it's the purview of the federal government. So if a federal project is happening and federal monies are coming to a project, they have to be reviewed for their historic significance. The thing is with fishing history and seafood industry history is that it's privately owned. These are private plats of land, these are private fishing boats, and so federal funding is usually not involved in the operation. As a result, people like the National Park Service or BLM or these other agencies who do a lot of the history work in Alaska have no reason to be involved according to federal law. And so this is a private initiative, it's privately owned history, and so we knew that we had to do this grassroots effort to spread the word around the state and to involve people within the industry in the history.
We just heard a lot about all the different people who arrived in these areas to work at these canneries. Katie, I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about the segregation that occurred and some of the discrimination among the various people that worked at some of the canneries.
Well, you can definitely see it in the real estate itself. Going back when Bob and I spent time at the cannery this summer, you can see that segregation in the real estate. For example, we went in to see the Filipino mess hall that was separated from what would have been the white mess hall. And now it's a laundry. So it also not only does the real estate show and reflect the segregation, but it also reflects change over time and the change in management decisions that integrated the workforce. But yeah, you had the native bunkhouse, you had the Italian bunkhouse, you had the Scandinavian bunkhouse, you had even a women's bunkhouse. When women were there, they were segregated as well, and they weren't allowed into many of the bunkhouses. So it was, and there were many reasons for these, the segregation, flat out, racism was certainly one, but there were also kind of management issues too. A lot of times groups came together and they fought, so they tended to separate crews. The other reason for separating, for example, machinists at the mess hall from other folks was that they had to get back to their machines sooner than everyone else, so it was imperative that they ate first. The other way in which the canneries were segregated was by management status, so the mess hall is a perfect illustration of this. So not only did you have different mess halls for different groups of people, but you also had kind of a class issue or segregation as well. So you had a room called the Blue Room, and that's where the superintendent would eat, or the other kind of office management type. But I do have to say that my father, when he ran the cannery, he integrated everything the minute he got into that position. It didn't make sense to him. And in fact, when I was a kid, we'd have to eat in the blue room. We all hated it. and then my dad, he got to the point where he would eat in the mess hall at the Filipino table, and I remember asking him why he did that, and he said, because no one bugs me here. But yeah, and you definitely, that's why this cannery is so interesting and important, because the actual buildings tell this story.
You can actually see that on some of the land status plats. The original documentation of the property and the like, and they would sketch out the canneries and identify certain buildings, and you would always see a China house. It was the China bunkhouse for the Chinese workers, and also on most of them, not far away, you'll see a Chinese burying ground.
Yeah.
Was there a hierarchy established between the various groups, the Chinese, the Mexicans, the Filipinos, as far as any sort of hierarchy or what the kind of work that they did?
You tended to not have all these groups working together at the same time. There were historical events that caused one group to be there at a certain time. For example, the Chinese were the primary group at the beginning, right? But then with the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Chinese began to whittle down, and they were replaced by the Japanese. And then when you get into the 1930s, as tensions started to increase, that would lead to World War II, you see Filipinos really starting to fill that void. So, but yes, there were always, gambling issues and other kind of territorial issues, and that's why every group had a boss. You had a China boss, or you had a Filipino foreman, and they were the ones who negotiated with the canners very specific contracts. And whether it was food or whether it was other kind of services, timed work, things of that nature.
We have some video, I think, of a 4th of July celebration here. Can you tell us what we're looking at in this particular video?
Well, it's wonderful because the Filipinos, they also celebrate the 4th of July. It's an important day for their national history as well. And so the 4th of July is a big deal at a cannery. And again, having all these different groups together wasn't always bad. People had these wonderful interactions and exchanges. So you see this mug-up experience on a dock in Bristol Bay at a Libby cannery, and you see all the different people, maybe some Italian fishermen, Filipino crew, men as well as women. And this extraordinary scene takes on. You see, obviously people drinking coffee, hence the name Mug Up, right? But then these Yupik guys start dancing. They've got their cannery gloves on, and you see the guy with the, using a coffee tin as transformed into a drum, and people are interested and engaged and fascinated at what they're seeing. And to me, this is just this wonderful example of how these canneries fuse together all of these cultures. So yeah, there were fighting and tensions, but there were also scenes like this that really bring us together. And we talk about diversity today in Alaska, but it's nothing new. We have been a diverse place for a very long time, and the canneries certainly are one of the explanations for that diversity.
These are also civil rights sites. When we're thinking about the history of the civil rights movement, it was the Alaska Cannery Workers Association, so a group of cannery workers that started documenting instances of segregation and discrimination in the canneries. And in the early 70s, they brought a suit against the New England Fish Company showing instances of discrimination and segregation, and the cannery workers won. It was one of the first times that a migrant labor group had won a major discrimination suit, and that prompted the desegregation of canneries in Alaska. So these are isolated places in the middle of nowhere in a way, but they're global communities, and they have national significance.
Bob, tell me a little bit about the technology that they used in some of these facilities. And earlier we saw the example of the iron chink, and also you brought some samples of cans here. Tell me a little bit about what they used in some of those.
When the industry started, and again, this was in the 1860s, it came up to Alaska in the 1870s and spread around in the 1880s. It was an entirely manual process. You read some of the early descriptions about canning, they say, well, take a sheet of tin and cut it this big and then roll it around and solder it to make it round and then solder an end on. And then they get around to the time to the fish. And the fish had to be butchered manually and the like. It was slow, it was very laborious, it kept production down. Gradually, technology was applied. They had some machines to solder the cans, which helped. They had machines that helped weigh the fish, move it along the line, fill the cans and the like. One of the big holes that was still left in the whole processing line was the machine to butcher it. And that was invented by a clever Canadian guy by the name of Edmund Augustine Smith, who actually on a dare went in and studied the Chinese workers and how they would butcher fish, and he tried to make a machine. It took him several years to get a draft version introduced and then tested out. And there were several others who were actually working on different machines, but his machine, with its regrettable name, the Iron Chink, was really helped the process. And it had the interesting consequence that mechanization of the industry didn't eliminate the need for processing line workers. In fact, it speeded up production. Canneries that started out having just one line of equipment would have 2, 4, 8. It increased production and it increased need for first Chinese and then other Filipino, Mexican, and other workers who came up. But that was a long struggle and a fascinating story just on the technological side of how these canneries developed.
And going back to the whole fish trap and the statehood period, didn't canneries, or at least the cannery companies, initially oppose statehood because they figured they would be regulated?
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah, they figured wrong. They liked the way things were going with fish traps. They liked the regulation, and they were afraid that if Alaska had too strong of a say, that they might lose some of their benefits. The fish trap is the classic example. They were able to pressure Congress as part of the statehood agreement that Alaska came in. In 1959, they said, well, we need a buffer zone because this industry is so important. We have so much investment. We need a little buffer zone. They thought it'd be 5 years or longer. It turned out it was just 1 year before the federal government turned it over to the state, and they immediately said, you know, we're not going to let you use these traps because Alaskans have voted. In fact, more people voted against fish traps in Alaska waters than voted for the Constitution itself.
But didn't eventual state management of the resource then pave the way for perpetual and sustainable use of the resource?
Exactly. You know, I think the state, when Alaska became a state, salmon runs were in terrible shape. The total catch in 1959 was just 25 million statewide. 25 million. That was all. And there was Governor Egan took strong action. He knew the importance of salmon to coastal communities and the state economy. And he told his Fish and Game Commissioner, a guy named Andy Anderson, he said, I want you to do whatever it takes. You know, I want you to bring back the salmon runs. They're so important. And Andy Anderson gave his biologists an order. Clem Tillion tells this story, which is great. He says, Andy Anderson said, look, I want you guys to make sure that we have escapement so these runs come back every year. And if that means closing down fisheries, you can expect fishermen and the processors to complain. But if you don't make escapement, you can expect to be fired. Well, they got that message, they took that orders, and fishermen and the processors did howl and did complain. And it didn't happen overnight. There are lots of other factors. Fish runs are really, really complicated and complex. But the runs did start to come back, and it's part of why I think we're seeing now the real strong production of salmon.
Now, Anjuli, you brought some items, and in the few minutes we have left here, let's take a look at them here for our audience here. I'll try to hold them up and maybe you can describe them.
Yeah, this is a scrapbook that belongs to our friend Karen Hofstad of Petersburg. She's a collector of salmon can labels. And she purchased this many years ago. It was likely a child that created this little scrapbook, but it has all of these beautiful historic salmon can labels. And so within the industry here, we're talking about fisheries management, we're talking about the cultures of Alaska, we're talking about the architecture, but there's also the history of marketing and advertising that we can talk about as well. And these are some beautiful works of art. Some are quite strange. I don't know what was happening with the Hume brothers at the time. They really like to highlight kids on like little children on the, I don't know, appealing to the housewife apparently. They're really remarkable pieces of art that talk about the history of advertising, the development of the industry, and within this scrapbook are examples of labels from all over Alaska.
That last one was from Taku Packing Company that had a cannery down in Taku Inlet. These are probably all, I'm guessing, from around the turn of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you could flip to the Dewey, I think it's the blue tab there. Yeah, this is one that's,
and again, just speaking to the cultural
It's a Juno
society, it really is an expression of cultural representation too.
This is maybe one of the only Juno brands that I know of, and actually shows Juno there depicted on the label. A really beautiful one. Maybe the purple is the one that has the Dewey.
And this one, the Admiral Dewey can label is particularly interesting because it dates back, of course, to the Spanish-American War. Mm-hmm. And you can see one of the great, the Great White, the ships of the Great White Fleet, one of the battleships, and the like. Many people in the industry credited the Spanish-American War with actually being pivotal for the canned salmon industry, because before then, people had a lot of consumers weren't comfortable with canned salmon. In early books and some of the early literature and reaching out to consumers, they actually have to explain to people how to open a can. But during the war, they spent a lot of, during the Spanish-American War, a lot of canned salmon was used to feed the troops. It was a good food. It was shelf stable. And it also, you could eat it right out of the can. You didn't even have to cook it if you didn't want to. So it was widely used, and I helped increase the popularity of a canned salmon product to consumers.
What were the primary markets in the early part of the canning industry?
In the early years, it was all domestic, and it was really nationwide. A lot of that got lost as salmon runs were weak later in the century. A lot of people turned to tuna and the like. But there was still a large market for canned product, especially in Britain and elsewhere.
Are there any other labels that?
Maybe the one on the back that is at the way back, flip it around, and this shows for the domestic market. So you can see it says it's Southland brand salmon, and so this was created specifically for the southern market. And so they created labels for England, for Australia. There's labels in Spanish, of course, but then just to appeal to different regions of the U.S., they also created specific marketing campaigns.
Now, some canneries might produce a whole pack of cans, and that same pack may be broken up by the broker, or for example, to different distributors, right? With
Yes.
different labels.
Mm-hmm.
So you would essentially be eating the same product with
Yeah.
different labels.
Mm-hmm.
And now, I think you may have mentioned this earlier, but there is somebody who collects these.
Yes. Yeah, and some of them have shown up actually on trash cans around Alaska. In Petersburg, in Kodiak, and Soon Craig, there are salmon can label trash cans that the city and individuals purchase to kind of highlight the history of the seafood industry. And they're I come from Kodiak, they're very popular. People even take selfies with the trash cans. So.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank all three of you for coming in and talking about this. I wish we had more time to talk about it. Anjuli Grantham, Bob King, Katie Ringsmuth, thanks very much.
Thank you,
Thanks for
Matt.
hosting us.
Yeah. You've been watching To Forum at 360. Thanks a lot for tuning in.
Funding for Forum at 360 comes from Rainbow Foods of Juneau.